He took a lot of innocence, any innocence I still had as a teenage girl, and he took my ability to function normal.
This is a facility that turned patients into prisoners.
Here we are today, worse off than we were back then. And I know it's directly related to the trauma she suffered at Cumberland Hospital.
Today, I'm going to be telling you about the Cumberland Hospital for Children and Adolescents. And in my opinion, this hospital of horrors should be shut down.
I've had official diagnosis of PTSD since all of this has happened.
In this video, I'm going to tell you about some of the crimes that have been committed against children at this hospital. It went on under the supervision of the medical director by the medical director, allegedly for at least 12 years. Definitely for 3 years while the hospital and the staff were under a Virginia State Police investigation.
She'd arrived the morning of October 17th, 2017. The exact same day the Virginia State Police would launch an investigation into allegations of abuse and neglect against certain Cumberland staff members.
I'm going to be showing you some of the victims' accounts of what happened during their stay. And it literally had me in tears what these young girls went through. Trigger warning, this involves the SA of children.
The judge didn't know where to put me, and so she called Cumberland at a court hearing, and she called and she's just like, I need to speak with Dr. Davidow now. And she was talking with him on the phone, and she just quite literally begged him to take me.
Also known as Cumberland Academy, Cumberland Hospital for Children and Adolescents is a 110-bed hospital founded in 1983. Located in New Kent County, Virginia, about a half an hour east of the state capital, they operate 94 hospital beds and 16 additional beds for residential treatment. They treat children and young adults ages 2 to 22 with complex medical needs, including chronic illnesses, brain injuries, and neurobehavioral disorders. They are a subsidiary of publicly traded, Pennsylvania-based Universal Health Services Incorporated, which operates behavioral health and other healthcare facilities across the nation. These people need to be held accountable.
One of the first people to greet her that day, the medical director, Dr. Daniel Davidow. Shortly after completing her paperwork, it was time for her physical exam.
Dr. Daniel N. Davidow, an independent contractor, is the hospital's former medical director from 1996 until he was put on leave in February of 2020. There have surfaced a number of allegations against him of abuse by a number of former patients.
He started by lifting up my shirt, and he's like, oh, I'm looking at your tubes. And then he just very suddenly started touching my breasts, and he had me slide down my pants, and then he grabbed my underwear actually and pulled them down. And I was obviously very tense because it's a very uncomfortable situation. And he was like, just relax, just relax. And he still did not have gloves on. Stuck his fingers inside of me, and he claimed that it was, he was checking pulses to make sure that they were okay.
The allegations claim the abuse went on for 12 years, which is extremely concerning, especially when you find out about the hospital's citations and the police involvement in investigations. His legal title as independent contractor grants him certain levels of autonomy and make oversight particularly difficult. But I will never understand how he got away with this for so long. The earliest records of misdeeds in the media occurred in July of 2006, but it wasn't published until November of 2008. The Los Angeles Times tells the story of Crystal Marshall, age 17 years old, who was waiting to be discharged to her foster parents in the days to come. However, she tragically experienced a seizure and a medical episode caused by a rare blood disorder. The hospital and staff had neglected her by not getting her the cardiac and neurological appointments with specialists as her doctors requested. The paper states, in the early hours, Crystal Marshall cried out for her mother. A nurse at Cumberland Hospital rushed to the girl's side as she began vomiting. Her head snapped to the right. Her legs jerked in seizure. Her pants soaked through with blood. The doctor on call heard Crystal's moans over the phone and told staffers to check whether she was faking the seizure. Over an hour passed before paramedics were called, and the staff was told to make sure it was a non-emergency, whatever that means. Unfortunately, Crystal passed away. A subsequent investigation shed light on the failures in providing health care for cardiac and neurological issues, and Cumberland received a citation for neglecting to get this patient proper routine and emergency care. A citation. Like a freaking speeding ticket or something. You would think this would throw up some red flags, and the hospital and the medical director would be closely watched. But the state of Virginia failed these patients, these kids, in the hospital. In April of 2017, 5 female patients alleged they were inappropriately touched by Dr. Davidow. The police report by the local sheriff's department states that the allegations came out in a group therapy session led by an intern when the girls discussed Davidow's magical touch to their intimate parts. The report also stated the girls advised the graduate student that Dr. Davidow would check their pulse under their breast and would play with their hair during the physical, twirling it around his fingers. A psychotherapist at the facility reported to investigators that after polling his patients, only 1 out of the approximate 12 patients present reported no inappropriate contact by Dr. Davidow. So 11 of the 12 patients reported inappropriate contact. He also told investigators that his boys group reported that Dr. Davidow took their pulse on their wrists, not the femoral pulse to check for stages of puberty as he did for the little girls. If you don't know what that is, because I sure didn't, it's a pulse your body has by your growing areas. I can assure you, in my 20 plus years of getting female exams and having 2 babies, my femoral pulse has never been checked. My pulse has always been taken on my wrist.
Dr. Davidow wasn't taking the femoral pulse of male patients. He wasn't taking the femoral pulse of patients when their parents were in the room. He was only taking the femoral pulse of patients when they were alone, when they didn't have somebody there to speak for them, and when they were the most vulnerable.
Davidow was interviewed about the allegations by the New Kent Sheriff's Office as well as the New Kent Department of Child Protective Services on May the 4th of 2017. The report stated, Dr. Davidow explains that during his exams, he is rating the patient on the Tanner scale, which is based on certain developmental characteristics of breast, genitals, and pubic hair, which is also why he checks the femoral pulse. While checking the femoral pulse on both sides, he advised that he can also feel for the pubic hair development in order for him to scale the patient.
Davidow's femoral pulse explanation was given during a May 4, 2017 interview with the New Kent County Sheriff's Office and Child Protective Services. It's documented in this police report, which was filed when Davidow was under investigation by the department for inappropriately touching 5 female patients. The allegations emerging from a group therapy session at the hospital when a number of girls told an intern about Davidow's, quote, magical touch during examinations.
It is reported that Davidow was performing these exams on a weekly basis.
She says Davidow would do it again, just days after her hospital stay began.
Because he's like, get up on the table and pull down your pants. And I was like, why? Like, why do I need to do that? I don't have any like medical reason. You would need to be doing these, because this had been probably less than a week since my admission date that he was doing this again.
What do you remember about that exam?
He had stuck his fingers inside. But I feel like it was definitely longer this time that he had done that. That like his fingers were inside, and he didn't speak much during this exam. He was very quiet, but he also did something that like I've never had done, and he was like touching other parts. I remember just like looking up, and like there were tears in my eyes, and I was just like staring at the ceiling.
And puberty does not progress that fast.
Dr. Davidow provides a justification that the purpose of his pelvic exams was to check the puberty of the patients. What we know for certain is that you don't need to check the puberty of a patient every week in a 6-week stay. So it's completely unfathomable why that would be ever appropriate.
Following that interview, the case was ruled unfounded.
And when you allow somebody who's abusing their power to then get away with it, it only fuels them more knowing that there's going to be no accountability.
Virginia State Police then began their own investigation into the hospital and staff in October of 2017. So for years, they investigated and did nothing. In January of 2019, Kimberly Bass was hired as the program coordinator for the 16-bed residential facility.
My job was basically overseeing all the programmatic measures of the residential treatment program.
She was let go just 7 months later. According to her, she was fired for doing her job.
I got fired for what? Because I won't sit back and allow kids to get abused, neglected, or exploited and do nothing about it.
She alleges on July the 28th of 2019, 2 minor girls were in a bedroom for 4 hours by themselves. Both girls had a history of S trauma, S abuse, and S acting out. And they are supposed to do 15-minute checks at minimum.
On July 28th, there were 2 minor girls in a bedroom for 4 hours. And both girls had a history of sexual trauma, sexual abuse, sexually acting out, and we do 15-minute checks at minimum.
It was reported to her that the checks were never performed that Sunday, and the teenagers admitted to S acting out. Bass says she called and informed the girls' parents and entered the incident into the CRIS system, initiating an investigation. Ultimately, Cumberland Hospital cleared the staff on duty that day of wrongdoing, and Bass was then fired.
I'm telling you about wrongdoings that are going on internally, and you write me up. I tell you about kids that are being neglected, and you fire me.
Bass sent an email to state officials on August the 20th documenting the alleged event. The state then sent a licensing specialist to Cumberland Hospital on September the 5th, conducting its own investigation. After reviewing 3 hours of video footage, they determined that staff did conduct rounds every 10 minutes and that individuals were in and out of their bedrooms. However, they were unable to interview the teens in the complaint because they had already been discharged. The investigation determined that the complaint was not substantiated and the hospital was in compliance with regulations. As for why Bass was discharged, Cumberland documented that it was for denying a resident use of the bathroom. Bass denies that allegation, and she did receive unemployment after an investigation determined that she was not fired because of any misconduct.
Any child has to use the bathroom. They go to their assigned staff and they make that request. That's not in my job description.
In addition to contacting state officials, I assume she also contacted CBS 6 because it was around that same time that they started an investigation into the hospital. And what they found is shocking. Between January and June of 2019, 24 incidents involving 10 patients at the residential facility weren't entered into the state's Computerized Human Rights Information System, or CRIS. This is required by the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services to be entered within 24 hours of the incident anytime anything occurs involving abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Somehow, they ended up with an internal report which didn't coincide with what had been reported to the CRIS system. And in June of 2019, the hospital was cited with noncompliance with human rights regulations, among several other citations. Incidents not reported included patients acting out, self-injuring, and patients being attacked, among other things.
According to a June 20th state inspection report, the hospital was cited for non-compliance with human rights regulations, one of several citations. The investigation found that between January and June, 24 incidents involving 10 patients went unreported.
Patient out of control, self-injury, patient attack. They played a game of lesbian truth or dare.
Cumberland blames Bass for not reporting the incidents, and Bass blames senior management for not informing her so that she could submit a report. She claims that the incidents happened on the weekends and at nights. On February the 5th, 2020, Herschel Micky Harden, 72, a psychotherapist at Cumberland, was indicted and charged with 2 felony counts of object penetration that occurred between October 2018 and April of 2019. When Harden was arrested, Dr. Daniel Davidow was put on administrative leave.
Well, CBS has just confirmed that effective last week, Dr. Daniel Davidow is on a temporary leave of absence from the medical staff at Cumberland Hospital for Children and Adolescents. News of Davidow's leave of absence comes on the same day that a Cumberland psychotherapist appeared in court for the very first time last week. 72-year-old Herschel Micky Harden was charged with 2 counts of object sexual penetration by force. Investigators say those crimes happened in 2018 and 2019, and the Virginia Attorney General's office confirms that the victim was a former female patient at the hospital.
In October of 2020, a civil lawsuit was filed for $127 million against the Cumberland Hospital, Dr. Davidow, the former medical director, and former psychotherapist Herschel Harden.
This Connecticut mom is speaking to CBS 6 about her daughter, one of 20 former patients who have filed a $127 million lawsuit against the Cumberland Hospital for Children and Adolescents in New Kent County and the company that owns it, UHS.
The filing cited negligence, assault, battery, child's right violations, and other crimes, and represented 20 plaintiffs, among them numerous young female patients. The plaintiffs are also claiming that the hospital operated without proper licensing and was devoid of fundamental sanitation or humanity, allegations that the facility denies.
Her mother says she was admitted to Cumberland Hospital at 13 years old for an eating disorder and suicidal behavior and discharged a broken child.
The plaintiffs also claim that the hospital committed fraud by keeping patients longer than necessary to maximize revenue, hiring inadequate staff to oversee its operation, and allowing older patients to abuse younger ones after hours.
There was an autistic boy who entered her room. He touched her inappropriately under her shirt, and she had to fend him off because nobody came to her aid. And she said it was pretty rough, too. It was not easy for her to get him out of her room. And when she complained to them, nothing happened.
The lawsuit claims MJM would be sexually abused again by the same resident, and she was also the victim of physical abuse. along with multiple other children as young as 9 who claimed they too were victims at the hands of other patients and staff.
Former patients of the residential treatment center recounted instances when they alleged they were essayed by Dr. Davidow. In fact, more than half of the 20 plaintiffs alleged non-consensual touching.
The accusers are all former female patients, some as young as 12 when they alleged the abuse happened. Each one tells a similar story, claiming that Davidow would take them to a private room and tell them he was going to check for their femoral pulse, which is located on the inside of the thigh. The suit alleges the doctor would then, quote, place his hand beneath the minor patient's undergarments and sexually abuse the minor patient by intentionally touching the minor patient's intimate part. Some of the plaintiffs allege they were abused multiple times, with one patient claiming Davidow also struck her with a belt if she would not behave.
On the other hand, allegations against Dr. Harden indicate he left one or more patients with bodily injuries.
The lawsuit alleges Harden physically battered male patient HGB by smacking him across the face with an open palm, causing him to fall on the floor and be injured. The boy was just 11 years old at the time.
Aside from the complaints against the two physicians, the hospital is accused of maintaining an inadequate staff that could not prevent residents from falling victim to S crimes, whether on behalf of employees or other patients.
That same patient also alleges he was once told by a nurse, quote, "It will be fine," after he reported being sexually abused in his room by an older resident.
Herschel Harden was scheduled for a plea hearing Monday, February the 22nd of 2021 at 9 a.m. At about 10 a.m., officers with Williamsburg Police were dispatched to his house for reports of a gunshot victim. The initial investigation revealed that the gunshot injury was self-inflicted, so he committed suicide on the day he was doing his plea.
I endured sexual abuse most of my life, but leading up to Cumberland, I was sexually trafficked for a year. And I was sent to Cumberland to be rescued from that, and I was put right back into like a trap, kind of like a prison.
Harden remained out on bail until his death. He was set to plead guilty to one count which carried a max sentence of life in prison if the other charge was dismissed.
He was like, "I'm gonna try something." He straight up goes in, he takes his hand, puts it on like the right side of my cheek, and just starts to kiss me and make out with me. And I'm like, what in the holy crap is this place? So I push him off of me, and he looks at me and he says, "Did that trigger you and did that bother you?" And I said, "Yeah, it did. I'm extremely uncomfortable." He says, "I want you to know something. What I just did was to help you." And I asked him, "How does that help me?"
The victim, which is Harden's former teenage female patient at the hospital, had filed a victim's plea opposition February the 15th, a week before Harden's sentencing.
And he pulled my pants down and started to take his fingers and force them inside of me. And he'd take his hand, like cuff it and put it over my mouth so that I didn't make noises. And the normal routine of turning on the little sound thing, make sure the blinds were closed, make sure the door was locked.
The opposition file outlined in detail more than 100 separate essays at the hospital over a 5-month period, starting in October of 2018 as Harden's patient. She is basically claiming that it occurred every weekday and sometimes on the weekends.
He sexually abused me so much, I can't even remember or count the times.
On July the 14th of 2021, Stacey Burrell, a 57-year-old former behavior technician at Cumberland Hospital, was indicted on one felony count of malicious wounding from an incident in 2019. Burrell was charged with maliciously causing bodily injury with the intent to disfigure, disable, or kill.
57-year-old Stacey Burrell was indicted by a multi-jurisdictional grand jury Wednesday on a felony malicious wounding charge.
On October the 25th of 2021, Burrell entered a no contest plea to an amended charge of unlawful wounding, which was originally malicious wounding, stipulating that evidence presented in the case would be enough to convict her of the offense. Surveillance footage showed Burrell caring for the victim at the time. The victim did not want to go to bed, so Burrell took the victim to the bathroom. Burrell and the victim emerged from the bathroom, with the victim having red marks on their body. The victim was redressed, and the defendant just completed her rounds. Burrell made up several stories on how the victim received the wounds, but the investigation showed that the hot shower was not the cause of the red marks.
Hayden said she was initially told the teen who suffers from a traumatic brain injury was accidentally burned in the shower. It wasn't until a month after the alleged incident, she says, the New Kent County Hospital called to inform her otherwise.
Burrell's recount of events was that she had a cup of hot water and that the victim sustained it while in the bathroom, whatever sense that makes.
One of the behavior takes on camera, going in the break room and into the bathroom multiple times, heating up water and pouring it on Jackson.
Jackson's medical records detail the second-degree scald burn his mom says he received as a result of the alleged abuse.
Burrell acknowledged that an injury had occurred, but claims that no intent was behind it, which is why the charge was reduced to unlawful wounding.
An investigation by the New Kent Department of Social Services in December 2019 determined the allegations were unfounded.
I think they need better training, or there needs to be an overhaul in many different, governing officials and departments there in Virginia.
She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but she only had to serve 1. In July of 2021, a second claim for $114.3 million was filed against Cumberland and Dr. Davidow. The second claim includes 18 additional plaintiffs, bringing the total number of alleged victims to 38, and the total dollar value to $241.3 million in damages.
For the second time in less than a year, a former medical director and the New Kent Children's Hospital at the center of a Virginia State Police investigation are facing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit.
One of the patients was as young as 7 years old when admitted, a male patient who allegedly was the victim of intentional physical and SA.
The suit also alleges a 7-year-old male patient by the initials BEJ was, quote, a victim of intentional physical and sexual battery and abuse. The lawsuit does not name the alleged abusers in this case, only saying that they were employees and other residents at the hospital.
And 17 are former female patients who said that they were abused by Davidow. One as young as 12 years old at the time. The lawsuit does not name all the alleged abusers in this case, only stating that they were employees and other residents at the hospital. 29 of the total 38 accusers claim Davidow SA'd them. The complaint also states the hospital and its owner knew or should have known Davidow was SA'ing female patients on a week-to-week basis, but they did not report the SA to the appropriate authorities on every occasion, and I completely agree.
The suit states multiple patients reported the alleged abuse to nurses, therapists, and other staff members. So, quote, the defendants knew or should have known defendant Davidow was sexually abusing female patients on a week-to-week basis, but did not report the sexual abuse to the appropriate authorities on every occasion.
This should have never been allowed to happen, much less over 12 years. Much less for 3 more years after it was first reported to police and CPS. The owners of the hospital needs to be held accountable. The fact that Davidow was an independent contractor is no excuse. In November of 2022, justice was partially served as Davidow was finally charged.
You can run, but you can't hide.
With 2 counts of aggravated sexual battery and 2 counts of object penetration, all felonies. Charging documents offer few additional details about the allegations, although they say both victims were children at the hospital. In the case of both the sexual battery charges, the indictments say Davidow abused the victim through her mental incapacity or physical helplessness. If convicted on all counts, Davidow would face a mandatory minimum of 12 years in prison under the Code of Virginia and could face up to life in prison, which he deserves. Even though Davidow has been under investigation by state police for over 5 years, he still holds his medical license to practice medicine in Virginia. I'm just sickened by this whole story. As a country, we need to do better to protect our children. There are so many agencies in the state of Virginia that failed these kids. UHS, the parent company, also needs to be held accountable. And all their facilities across the country needs to be investigated to ensure this kind of behavior isn't going on at any of the other ones.
What you took away from these kids and what you did to the families is irreplaceable. There's no amount of money that can give us our life back, give us our daughter back. It's comparable to death for so many parents. And we know that's final.
I've been taught to forgive. That's with my faith, we forgive those that cause harm. We don't forget, but in order to heal, we have to forgive.
RH says while she'll never forget the hurt that took place here, part of the work she has left is forgiving the people she says took what little innocence she had left.
I try not to let the past define my future.
You were a terrible human being. You destroyed me, you destroyed my family. But I'm okay. I am doing better. I am working through this. The person who's going to be knocked down forever is you.
Dr. Davidow absolutely denies all allegations that he ever sexually assaulted or abused any patient at Cumberland. We are confident that when these matters are tried in court, the evidence will clearly prove that these allegations are completely without merit.